Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name's Alan Morrison. I'm a professor of law and finance at the Surrey Business School. I'm joined here today by my co-host Rita Mota, who is the Intesa Sanpaolo Research Fellow at the Centre for Corporate Reputation of the Surrey Business School, and by Itziar Castello, who is Senior Lecturer in the Department of Digital Economy at Surrey Business School. Itziar is an expert on corporate social responsibility and sustainability in digital transitions, and she's very widely published in the management and business ethics literatures. I'm going to turn the floor over to her in a moment, but before we start, I just want to make a few general remarks about the seminar. So, the seminar is hosted with the generous support of the Centre for Corporate Reputation, which is an interdisciplinary research centre directed by Rupert Younger here at the Surrey Business School in Oxford. The centre's got a mission to perform research, teaching and engagement on matters related to organisational reputation and other forms of social evaluation. Within Oxford, the centre is currently home to 6 postdoctoral researchers and 2 doctoral students, and more widely, we're the focal point for a network of around 40 senior academic international research fellows and about 50 visiting fellows, all of whom are senior figures from the worlds of business, policy and the public sector. My own rather minor role in all of this is to chair the centre's steering committee, and I also have the very good fortune to work with some of the centre's outstanding researchers, of whom Rita is one. The centre's usual range of seminars and conferences has been interrupted by the current pandemic, as has our annual symposium in Oxford, and it's therefore particularly pleasing that we're able to run the Retro seminar online this term. Retro, that is Reputation, Ethics, Trust and Relationships at Oxford, is concerned with the ethical and normative content of trust and reputation in organisational life. Our Oxford-based retro seminars in the past have generated a lot of excellent face-to-face conversations. And one silver lining to the dark corona cloud is that we can try to include many more people from around the world in those conversations. I know that today we're welcoming people from Canada, the United States, continental Europe and India, and I've doubtless omitted some other places from that list. Rita and I are going to take turns hosting these events. I inveigled the first slot largely so I'd have a formal opportunity to thank some people. Taking these seminars online proved to be a much more significant task than at least I had anticipated. So I'm extremely thankful that Rita was here to manage the process. Without her energy, enthusiasm and her general motive force, these seminars would never have got off the ground. And both she and I are very grateful to Marie Watson, who worked extremely hard to administer the seminars and to sense check our correspondence, and also to Mark Hughes Morgan and Chris Page, who enabled what turned out to be extraordinarily complicated online messaging and booking. Okay, on to business. Itziar's paper addresses important questions that sit at the heart of what the Centre for Corporate Reputation Centre does. She's going to talk about online deliberation and the ways that emotional reactions inform and can assist that deliberation. The work emphasises the importance of language in creating and sustaining trust in online fora, and she discusses the narratives that emerge from those forums. So she speaks to important questions about trust, reputation, and social evaluation that are at the heart of what the Centre does. She also sheds light upon the ways that those phenomena shape our collective reasoning about moral issues. Because there are so many people in the seminar today, we've had to be slightly formal about the way that we engage. If you have questions during the presentation, please enter them into the Q&A window, which you can find in a button at the bottom of your screens, rather than into the chat, and either Rita or I will relay them to Itziar. She's going to speak for 20 to 30 minutes, during which time she's planning to respond to clarification questions only, and after that, I hope we can have a reasonably wide-ranging discussion. We're going to finish promptly at 5 o'clock. So, Itziar, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alan. I'm going to share my screen now so you can see my presentation. Fantastic. So good afternoon, everybody. It is a pleasure to be presenting today in the first retro webinar fully online. Before I start, I want to thank Rita Mota and Professor Alan Morrison for organizing the talk and inviting me. Today, we are going to discuss about how online deliberation shapes sustainability agendas. I will first present one of my working papers on this topic, then I will dedicate some time at the end of the paper presentation to reflect about how the sustainability agenda is being reshaped in COVID times and how it relates to my own research. The title of my paper I'm presenting today is Emotional Constructive Dissent in Online Deliberation. It's a paper co-authored by myself and by David Lopez Berzosa, my colleague at Exeter, who is an amazing data scientist as well as a management scholar. This paper analyzes the debates online of multiple stakeholders on one of the grand environmental challenges of the era of pre-COVID, which is plastic pollution. I came across this issue of plastic pollution 10 years ago. Back then, I was doing a research visit at UC Berkeley. One afternoon, I attended a talk by the photographer Chris Jordan and the activist Manuel Maqueda. In this talk, they were sharing the experiences in the island of Midway, where they show thousands of baby albatross dying due to the ingestion of plastic. I came out of this talk almost in tears. I was shocked by the emotion content of their messages. They fully convinced me not only that I had to stop using any plastic right now, but also that the issue of plastic pollution was going to be almost as important as climate change in the future. That was 10 years ago when nobody was talking about plastic pollution. 10 years later, in 2020, when we are now, the issue of plastic pollution has become one of the key items in the environmental agenda in corporations. And the agenda has evolved enormously. Today, we see how big corporations talk not only about recycling, but also about the importance of the reduction of plastic. Corporations have introduced some of the elements of the agenda of the NGOs, and they are engaging with them in conversation. So this is what we are going to talk about today, how NGOs and corporations are engaging in conversations about plastic pollution. The theory of deliberation and deliberate democracy has been broadly used to analyze the process of stakeholder engagement and the evolution of sustainability agendas. Deliberative democracy sets the conditions to create consensus. But today, part of these dialogues happen online in platforms such as Twitter and Facebook. Most of the existing literature on online deliberation, including my own articles, criticize the deliberative quality of social media platforms. Dissent and polarizing voices, rather than consensus, are the hallmarks of online engagements. The article I'm presenting today challenges this assumption and looks at how some forms of deliberation are happening online. To analyze deliberation online, we move out of the theories of deliberative qualities and embrace the critical deliberation debate. This debate looks at contentious engagements, questions Habermas's notions of public interest in the sense that not all the engagements and not all the stakeholders aim at consensus, and see discourses as a reflection of the tumult of political life rather than as a problem. Agonistic pluralist theories argue that the stakeholder groups will seek to domesticate hostility and gain a position of hegemonic control while recognizing the other in constructive dissent. The process to domesticate hostility and the creation of constructive dissent is therefore at the basis of the analysis of deliberation. The importance of emotions in constructive dissent has been acknowledged in the studies of agonistic pluralism. However, beyond a light mention of passion, little work looks at how emotions can foster constructive exchanges. Emotions, however, are becoming a fundamental part of the sociological and the institutional studies of change. Emotions are indicative of what is important to people. Two emotions have been described as fundamental for change: moral emotions and social emotions. Moral emotions connect actors to social norms, and passionate exchanges based on social emotions can promote people's identification with others. But only few studies look at how these emotions are combined, and none at how they create constructive dissent online. So our research question focused on precisely these two elements: constructive dissent and emotions. We therefore ask how constructive dissent is configured and what is the role of emotions in promoting engagement. And we look at this in the stakeholder engagement on the issue of plastic pollution, mainly in the US. My 10 years of research in the issue of plastic pollution, doing interviews, participating in meetings, and reading articles on the issue helped me to create a map of the key stakeholders in US in the last 10 years. So this is the first thing we did in this research. We follow a snowball approach that helps us to configure more than a complete view of all the actors participating in the debate, a view of a community engaging in a dialogue. We aim at analyzing their conversations online, and we choose Twitter as a platform because it has become the most important platform for political debates, and the data is open. The scraping of Twitter has restrictions. We could only get 3,000 tweets per actor. For the small actors, that was more than enough, since we were able to get the whole history of their messages online since 2009. For the big actors, we could only have a sample of the recent messages. We therefore do not have a comparable longitudinal data, but a sample of tweets that go from 2009 to 2020 of different actors. We downloaded 128,000 tweets, but after cleaning and looking at the tweets about recycling, we came up with a database of a little bit more than 8,000 tweets. We applied a novel research method using deep learning at the service of qualitative research. We use the emotion detecting engine Lola that my co-author David has created to analyze the emotions. Lola has been able to impress Google, and they are accelerating us now, and other organizations as well, like the Turing Institute and the INCIBIAT Spain. Lola works on the issue of online harms, and it's able to detect in a very accurate way emotions such as fear, love, hate, trust, etc. So the basis of our methodology is this combination of deep learning at the service of qualitative research. So in order to do that, and as a summary of our methods, I have created this little graph. Here we see that after the mapping of the key stakeholders and the selection of the tweets containing recycling and its variations, what we did is we wanted to understand how polarized are the debates and how much hate is there. So we measured this with Lola, our research engine. To our surprise, we observed that only 1.1 of the messages contain extreme hate. We also look at signs of deliberation using measures of deliberative quality already present in the literature. We measure endorsement and amplification and saw that most of the constructive messages that had these features, so most of the constructive messages have features of deliberation. We therefore conclude that most of the messages of our group of stakeholders were constructive instead of destructive and had some elements of deliberation. Then we look at a random sample of 10% of our tweets and read the tweets to understand what they were talking about. We look at meanings, but also at the emotional content to define their intentional components. And that's the moment where we develop the actual coding. After reading many tweets and going back and forth into the theory, we developed a model of constructive dissent based on the role of emotions. So that is our qualitative part, the qualitative aspect of our presentation. We then created a measure of different emotions in Lola and validated the model, again in a quantitative way. In the first test, and this needs to be improved since this article is very much in the process of construction, we found that 1.2% to 6% of false positives in the different emotions, which is quite good for a validation of the model. Then in point 7, we analyzed the model and we did a descriptive statistics to understand the distribution of each of the emotions per stakeholder. So that's the summary of our methods. First mapping, then in a quantitative form, sample the discourses, measure the measure of constructiveness and destructiveness, and understand the quantity of hate, which was very low. Then creating measures of the deliberative quality that were very present in our constructive messages. Then going into the qualitative process, creating the model through actual coding, and then validating again the model through quantitative methods. So what did we find? We classified the emotions, so they explain how people create sense of the issue of plastic pollution and the key linguistic activities that configure a stakeholder engagement. We found 3 big activities in stakeholder engagement. The first one, the problem recognition. The second one, the construction of the argument. And the third one, the consolidation of the argument. In each of the activities, we distinguish the use of several emotions. For example, in problem recognition, we saw tweets of catharsis, but also we distinguished tweets of uncertainty. In the construction of the argument, we saw tweets of trust, but also of inclusive empathy and of energetic empathy. In the consolidation of the arguments, we saw tweets of excitement, but also tweets that reflected the emotion of attachment. And we created in an inductive way, through actual coding, all these emotions on the basis of the relation to the literature, of course. So that's the model that we constructed. Most interestingly, we also saw that in each of these big activities, there was an interesting tension. Some emotions, such as catharsis, trust, and excitement, were helping the actors to define their moral arguments. In the case of the NGOs, for example, the fact that refusing was the good solution to the problem of plastic pollution. creating a dynamic of contestation. However, other emotions, such as uncertainty, inclusive empathy, attachment, were promoting the sense of witness and creating a dynamic of inclusion. So in each of the big activities of the stakeholder engagement, we saw dynamics of contestation kind of compensated with dynamics of inclusion, a mechanism that we call inclusive contestation. Let me show you some data. These are examples of the tweets that we found that are in our database. For example, in problem recognition. Problem recognition was done with some very cathartic messages, showing pictures of dead albatross or whales, making people feel as if the end of the world was approaching. As you can see in this tweet that shows in the screen, the organization Plastic Pollutes recreates this image of the albatross and says, albatross, unflinchingly shows the horror and grief of the tragedy of our impact on these grateful birds. Signaling the reference or referencing to the problem of that albatross, thousands of albatross are dying because of plastic ingestion. At the same time, different organizations issue messages that open up the possibility of dialogue. For example, arguing about how that corporations could be doing good things as well. As we can see in this other tweet issued by Beth Terry, in which she asked at the Starbucks what's on the press, and she says that she doesn't know, and she asks, and what happens to the plastic at the store? More data. In the construction of the argument, we observe the same dynamics. Tweets that intended at creating trust in some of the arguments, reinforcing the moral position of the actors. For example, in these tweets where we see references to the New Yorker, the popular publication, or a report, a scientific report, given legitimacy to these moral arguments. At the same time, we also see tweets that created the dynamics of inclusion, expressing agreements with other actors and showing signs of mutual awareness with signs like @ but also with words reflecting agreement, like this sentence saying, we totally agree, or agree, as we can see in these two tweets. The same happens in the final activity, the consolidation of the argument. In the activity of consolidation of the argument, we can see tweets of excitement such as, "Get busy, let's legislate to ban plastic bags," issued by Manuel Maqueda. But at the same time, we also find dynamics of inclusion. For example, the tweets that say, "I'm so excited to see that restaurants like Freddy Flamingo are committed to sustainability." So again, in all these activities, we see these dynamics of moral dissent, of moral confrontation, but also of the dynamics of inclusion. Who does what? Do different stakeholders use different emotions? All these tweets I showed you were from activists and NGOs. So this process is very much led by the tweets of the activists claiming for refuse. There is contestation and there is inclusion as well. However, in our sample, we have a lot of tweets from corporations as well. And basically, we have the same number of tweets per each of the big stakeholders. However, to our surprise, when looking at the messages per stakeholders, we saw that although most of the motions are at least used a few times by all the actors, corporations issue tweets that tend to invite other actors to the conversation and messages with emotions such as inclusive empathy. We conclude that in the issue of plastic pollution, at least, corporations were keen on integrating the new agenda of reducing plastic pollution, and they were willing to engage in the conversation mostly led by big NGOs and activists, keeping an inclusive profile. So we saw that corporations were still defending their agenda with normative position and their agenda of recycling, but very often, most of their tweets, they were using these emotions of inclusive empathy, energetic empathy, creating this dynamic of inclusion. So with that, we thought about our contribution and the contribution to the theory of critical deliberation, but also to how different actors can engage online in order to create deliberation and come up with new ideas, new agendas, and improve the relationship between them. So first, what we are doing in this article is to provide an example of a sustainability debate online in which engagement rather than polarization, in which construction rather than negative polarization is the norm. We propose a framework for analyzing the deliberative dynamics on the basis of constructive dissent. We saw the importance of emotional dynamics of stakeholder engagements and propose that these dynamics happen in what we call inclusive dissent. So moral contestation is compensated with dynamics of inclusion. We also saw how different stakeholders have preferences for some type of emotional tweets. But with this model, we are able to provide an understanding of how engagement happens and how the actors are able to use emotion in order to create these compensated dynamics. What do I take from my research and on how the sustainability agenda is being redefined in COVID times? And this is the second part of my talk. So I presented my article first, and then I wanted to reflect with you about how the COVID is kind of redefining the agenda and what can we learn from my research. So first of all, I guess this article provides a method and a model to understand stakeholder engagement and how new sustainability agendas are configured. It also helps us to reflect about how we can create a dialogue between the COVID agenda and the environmental agendas of climate change and plastic pollution. My observations, and this is purely based on observation without having created a big database, as I did with the issue of plastic pollution, is that the COVID agenda is displacing climate change and plastic pollution at the very moment. We are seeing how environmental programs, conferences, and strategies have been freezed. To this freezing, what I'm observing in the engagements online are different reactors of the key actors. Some actors are adopting a very confrontative discourse. They use hashtags like "not going back," "winds of change." Some other actors are talking about the opportunity for governments to enforce environmental principles in companies in exchange of bailouts. But most of the actors that I've been able to observe are embracing the new COVID agenda and keeping business as usual, but very low key, the messages on climate change. Our article can help us to reflect about how inclusive dissent can help to integrate these two agendas. The agenda of COVID, which is, I guess, inevitable right now, with the agenda of climate change, climate emergency, and plastic pollution, that to my view are very much in need still. Actors supporting climate change and plastic pollution should create messages that defend the care about the environment and at the same time be inclusive of the COVID needs and the emotions that generates in people. So engagements should recognize the environmental agendas, be normative about the importance of addressing climate change, but include issues such as safety, care, and the struggles of the economy. The use of emotions are going to be key in creating the dialogue in these combined but often contradictory agendas, especially because the COVID agenda is very emotional. And I wanted to end this talk reflecting about this picture. This is a picture of the unrealized plan of the city of Cancun, Mexico. It's a forest city designed by Stefano Boeri. This picture helps me to think about the possibility of integrating contradictory concepts with a bit of imagination and technology. For me, the city is the antithesis of the forest. But this picture gives me the possibility to engage in a conversation on how the city and the forest can work together. I think understanding the stakeholder engagement as full of contradictions, but also full of possibilities of constructive engagements can help us to create a new sustainability agenda in which the social, the economic, and the environment can be integrated in these very difficult times of COVID-19. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Itziar. I find your research absolutely fascinating. I'd like to ask you a question to start, but I'd also like to encourage all of our participants to type their question into the Q&A box. We'll be looking at that and then relaying your questions to Itziar. So my question refers to the very beginning of your presentation. I was quite surprised when you said that you found very low levels of destructiveness in your data, especially with something such as plastic pollution. You'd expect people to be quite emotional to the extreme. And I was wondering if the actors that you chose to conduct this analysis are in some way affecting these findings, because I would expect that if you had sampled tweets from individuals from the general population, you might have found higher levels of destructiveness. And I was wondering if corporate actors, NGOs, lobbyists might have some other concerns, such as reputational concerns, that might lead them to moderate their language and reduce the angry and hateful tones.
Thank you very much, Rita. This is an absolutely fundamental question. And I do believe the selection of the sample has in some way moderated the emotional energy, the level of hate in their discourse. And we purposely looked at a community that was engaging in conversations, right? So we could recreate a little bit in real time, as we do in real life, how actors look at Twitter and how they make sense of what's happening through Twitter. And when you look at Twitter, you have in your feed the people that you are following, your friends, your acquaintances, but you don't get in your feed everybody. So these people are a community, they know each other, they talk with each other. So we wanted to recreate how Twitter works in our minds. And probably this is why we found a low level of toxicity. But we had exactly the same question that you were having, and we were surprised, 1.1, this is too low. And so we decided to do a test with another actor that it's very polemic and that we expected to have a very high level of hate in her tweet account or tweets related to her. So we download about 2,000 tweets related to Greta Thunberg, the great climate emergency activist, as you all know her, because she has been subject to hate speech, and we knew that. And to our surprise, using the same algorithm, in her tweet, we only saw a level of 3% of hate. So our conclusion was, okay, our numbers are fine. It's true, our community is a little bit more soft, the community of plastic pollution, that everything that is happening to poor Greta. But what is happening in the internet is not so much about hate speech. There's a lot of constructive dissent and deliberation. So I think we are fine in this point.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I think it would be a good idea to follow up with a question from Jennifer Goodman. Thank you, Jennifer. She's asking how much of the emotion in the tweets is identified from the text and how much the pictures and emoticons. Do you take both into account?
Thank you. Unfortunately not. So our engine is only analyzing text. So we convert the tweets into text and we analyze the text. We don't analyze the emoticons either. So we are just using words and some symbols. We are starting to introduce some symbols. So question marks, exclamation. This we take into consideration, and we are training Lola, which is our engine, natural language processing engine, with those signs. But unfortunately, we are not able to do picture recognition yet. I hope David will be able to introduce this soon, and that will be fantastic because it's absolutely necessary to understand what happens in Twitter. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have a question from Laura Spence, which is closely related, another data question. Can you say something about time in your data and your analysis? So in particular, is there changing emphasis or different approaches over time?
Yes, timing is one of our probably one of the problems that we are having in this data sample. As I explained a little bit when I was explaining my methods, what we were able to do, we have the limitation of Twitter of 3,000 tweets per user. That means that the big accounts, so the corporate accounts, the big NGOs accounts, we were able to only download quite recent tweets, 3,000 tweets. However, for other activists, the journalists, the smaller accounts, we were able to download the whole account because they didn't have 3,000 tweets. So although I would love to have a database of all the tweets or random tweets, and we will do that probably in the future if we find a bit of money, because we need to pay Twitter to do that, quite a lot of money. So although I love to have a sample that randomly analyzes from 2009 to 2020, so a little bit more of 10 years, 11 years of discourse of plastic pollution, we are only able to, we cannot compare time, we cannot analyze time with the data that we have right now. We are just able to try to understand this process of sense making from a sample of tweets that happened in 2009, but happened in 2020 as well. And what we can see there is that it's true that, but this we cannot create like a temporary analysis, right? From my qualitative looking at the tweets at the beginning of the sample, so the tweets in 2009, that are very much from activists and small NGOs working on plastic pollution, they are very contestative. They are more into this first part that we call the problem recognition and the setting of the normative agenda. And they are very much cathartic, very much about how plastic, it's a big issue and you have to be aware about that. And then what we are seeing is that in corporation, the tweets from corporates, we are seeing that they are more recent. So they have this other type of emotions, curiosity, inclusive empathy, energetic empathy, that are very much related to be open to new actors and new ideas. I do believe, and this is not like what I can conclude from the data, but I do believe that corporations in any case have during some time had this position of not being very normative and very kind of positioning very strongly, but they are more inclusive because this is reducing risk of reputational damages for them. So they prefer to situate in a more mild, in a more this inclusive empathy mode that helps them to reduce the risk. And so in terms of time, my question is, Laura, give us some money. We will do the research as you want.
Great. I have another question here from Mark Elliott. Mark is asking if the level of anger in a debate depends on the extent to which people see that debate as controversial. And so he also asks how you normalize your findings to take account of that.
Okay, this is, so the level of anger relates to how they see the issue as confrontative, is that?
Yeah, so if a debate is seen as very controversial, it would elicit different levels of anger.
Yes, I cannot prove this with this research, right? So I cannot compare different discourses with different levels of controversies. I'm only focused on one type of engagement, one type of discourse, the agenda of plastic pollution. Again, looking at the Greta Thunberg tweets, I was surprised that the level of hate was so low when we took a big sample, right? So there is hate. There's hate when there is controversy. I'm not sure. I guess if there's no controversy, there's no hate, but I'm not sure either, right? Because what we are seeing is different positions. In any case, I cannot answer this with this research. It will need me to be able to compare different discourses, different levels of hate. What we are doing now with Lola is, and this is a bit of a side conversation, but it's possibility for food for thought, is we are downloading the controversies related to fake news in the COVID period, because we've all seen a lot of fake news and how they appear in Twitter and how they are promoted. So probably in our next research, we will be able to answer maybe a bit this type of questions. Thank you.
Okay, I have a more technical question. It comes from Bruce Gahir. And I'm going to expand it slightly because it touches on questions that occurred to me when I read your paper. And it's about the a sort of philosophical understanding that we have of emotion, which comes from virtue ethicists like Martha Nussbaum and Robert Solomon, who view emotions as being deliberate judgments almost, that reflect my worldview and that help me to maintain a narrative understanding of my position in the world. So I guess a question that Bruce is asking and that I'm asking in a related way is, to what extent the types of dialogues you're talking about occur constructively when the narrative understandings people have of their position in the world clash? And if that's the case, this relates to Laura's question, I suppose. as these dialogues occur, and people reach some sort of resolution of the situation, do their emotions change? Do their narrative views of themselves change? Can we understand emotions, in other words, as being rational responses to our worldviews, in short, that change as our worldviews evolve through deliberation? And is there any way you could capture that with your data? I know that's an awful lot of questions.
Mm-hmm. So I guess your positioning about irrationality on the understanding of emotion, it's also debatable in a way, right? Because we are seeing emotions that relate to this passion and irrationality, but the other part of the emotions that we are analyzing are very much connected to how social norms are enforced. So in that sense, for me, the emotions help me to understand, so beyond cognitive elements that configure my sense making, that relate to this passion, but relates to my morality and the morality that it's proposed and enforced by my community, right? So in relation to that, how being engaged in these dialogues change our view of the world, and how the fact that emotions are there can help us to promote the deliberation. Was that what you were asking exactly? Or
so the view that I'm leaning on, I suspect Bruce is asking about in his question, is the idea that emotions they're never irrational. You know, we kind of choose to fall in love, we choose to be angry, and they reflect a worldview.
yes.
And when we form those emotions, we reinforce a worldview, or perhaps we change it. And that means that when two emotional perspectives come into conflict, it is possible that the people who hold those emotions wind up feeling some empathy for each other and changing their worldview as a consequence, and hence the sort of emotions that they form. Is that a plausible interpretation of what's going on here?
This is very much what, by this mechanism of inclusive contestation, somehow we are representing, and we are doing it in a very concrete analysis of the emotion. So there is this moral arguments, moral emotions related to catharsis, excitement, that help us to keep this contestation. But also there is these other emotions that create empathy, that help us to, as you were saying, resolve this emotional conflict of another worldview, that it's possible, right? So in that sense, it could be an interpretation, and this is not a new idea. Jasper and other people in social movements talk about the importance of this tension between the moral shock, as they call it, and the creation of winners or inclusion, right? In order to be able to make sense of things and continue moving forward in an agenda that is conflictive and that we take as emotional. So it is very much. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That was a good answer to a particularly gruesome question. Rita, you had a question.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you something that Lawrence Kramer, who is from Saïd as well, just asked, and I think it's a really good question. Lawrence asks, are you able to separate out the emotional statements and the reason statements in the tweets? Because the reason statements could provide a basis for comparing digital exchanges with the kind of dialogue aimed at in deliberation.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We are not doing that, and I understand where this comes from, the separation of rationality and emotions. What we have done is, because of the agenda of deliberation is very much based on the importance of the rational argumentation and cognitive and political aspects, right? When we go to critical deliberation, to the political positions of the different actors, we are saying, hey, emotions are also important. And emotions can help us not only to understand that there is hate there and that nothing is going to happen, but on the contrary, there's some use of emotions that help you to move through the agenda. But so the technical answer is, unfortunately, we are not. With Lola, what Lola does, the fantastic natural language engine that we have, is detect on the basis of not a dictionary, but a machine learning technique, detects 8 emotions at the moment. So I guess we should have to create another natural language engine and then process the same text and then look at keywords of rationality or something like that. But that will be interesting. That will be interesting. We are just focusing on trying to bring to the agenda and the debates of deliberation the importance of emotions that is very much forgotten, I would say.
There's so much you can do with these data.
There's so much you can do. Yes, thank you.
Okay, as we're approaching the end of the hour, I'm going to combine 2 questions. We've got an awful lot of questions coming up now from Rupert Younger and Seth Jensen, who are asking closely related questions. They're both, Rupert's asking about whether you see the emergence of clusters in the data and whether the size of clusters affects the potential for constructive consensus. And I think the kind of closely related questions coming from Seth, who says that very often Twitter seems like a sort of Wild West shootout of individuals. But if outcomes, if Twitter arguments can seem to have outcomes, you might imagine that coordinated participation could occur. And coordinated participation is one way in which the clustered action could occur. Do you see that sort of coordination occur? And if it does, could it change the way that we think about emotional debate in these contexts? Is there a role here for people deciding to act together as good cop and bad cop or something like that?
That's very interesting. Very, very interesting thought. So about the clusters of data, well, we do have clusters. We do cluster the emotions basically in two big basic emotions that relate to what we call more passion and more hate, right? And then we are defining each of the emotion, right, in Lola with the different characteristics. So at the end, there is this emotions of positiveness and the emotions of negativeness, and the only thing is that we have subcategories, and from the subcategories we're able to define catharsis, uncertainty, curiosity, trust, impulsive empathy, etc. Right? So at the end, there is some type of clustering in a way, right? And the size of the clustering is defining, well, if you do, the clustering is just a tool for me, right? It's a way of analyzing my data and making sense of the data. So when I'm looking at big samples of data, I'm using clustering in order to understand what's happening there. So, and then to the second point, if I understand it correctly, right? So is there the possibility of coordinated participation in the sense of positive and negative? I think there is, at least in our data, there's coordination amongst actors, because a lot of coordination happens offline, and definitely coordination on the promotion of the discourse happen online. And we are seeing that when people retweet, tweet from one actor that it's a friend, or comment negatively in an actor that it's not a friend, that it's in the opposite side. And we are definitely seeing a lot of coordination in this process of agenda creation and stakeholder engagement or multi-stakeholder engagement. So definitely there is coordination in Twitter, and emotions play a very important role. And there's plenty of studies that says that negative emotions are more treated, whether tweets with more positive emotions create less likes but more retweets, right? So there is plenty of research that looks into that. Yes. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question before our hour is up. Rita, do you want to ask it?
Sure. Well, this next question I think is relevant both for plastic pollution, other environmental issues like that, but also the current pandemic. Arunma is asking about the impact of fake news, the types of sources that people cite in these tweets. And I was wondering also about just manipulation of facts, manipulation of opinions, and what role do those maneuvers play in the type of process that you describe?
I think that's a crucial question to understand what's happening in many areas of especially the new agenda of COVID. In this particular research sample that I have about plastic pollution, because I've controlled my key actors, we have selected the actors on the basis that I know them almost all personally because I've been doing research for years on this issue of plastic. And if I don't know them personally, I know who engaged with whom, etc. Right? We have very much controlled this problem of fake news. But in the next research that we are going to do about how fake news configure the agenda of COVID, especially the social agenda, I guess, and the environmental agenda, which I'm very worried about. So understanding how fake news are configured and how the manipulation, not only the manipulation of facts, which in my research I won't enter into understanding whether facts are real or not. So we will take the fake news per se, and in this fake news means that the facts, at least some facts are not true, and that is a fake news. So once you define it like that, there's some untruthness to that. But at least how emotions help to disseminate this fake news and make people believe, right, in this fake news. So for me, this is what I'm very interested in, what my future research is about, is how emotions help to disseminate this fake news. And I'm very convinced that in the case of COVID agendas, the fake news are playing a very important role, and we have to analyze this seriously. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That was a fascinating hour. I'd like to thank the chair for stimulating so much thought and so many questions. I'm sorry if you asked a question and we didn't get to it. Fortunately, this whole thing's being recorded, and that means all of your questions are also recorded. So we will pass a PDF of questions on to Itziar so that she can think about them. There are some really good ones here about alternative data sources and possibility for different ways of performing the analysis that we could go on for another hour with. But I promised we'd finish promptly on time, and we're going to do so. So thank you again, Chair, for a fantastic seminar, and thank you everyone for your comments and for coming. I'm just going to close with an advertisement. Next week, Ian Munro is going to talk to us about whistleblowing. That promises also to be excellent, and I do hope that as many people as possible will show up and stimulate us with their questions again. And on that note, I think I'm going to stop. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.